if you only had one gospel, what would yours be? And while it's very subjective, and thankfully we don't have to do that, it's very interesting and very common how popular John is, just because of the nature of the topics and the things that he covers. I won't, only the Lord will know. I estimate that I probably taught through the Gospel of John over 60 times, because I got to teach John regularly in a school curriculum anytime we had a class with new Christians or other stuff. And John was and we'll end with this tonight, John was my tool to talk with non-Christians coming totally out of the darkness and talking to them about becoming a Christian. And we're going to study the Gospel of John. And so John has just been very much at fingertips, both in thought and in use. But I heard a story, and this may have been from Leon Morris, I don't remember. But it's very sad. A mother was dying and called her adult children, 4 children, into the room. And she knew that she wasn't going to live very long. And to the firstborn, she said, "Greg, you have always been my favorite." And the other 3 just kind of went, "Oh, okay. Mom's about to die, and now she lets it out." Okay. You may not get this. Smothers Brothers, Mama, was it like you best, or there's always some argument between the 2 brothers about which one did Mama like best. Hey guys. This is kind of like being punished and having to sit on the front of the class. Now, if you weren't talking last week, you wouldn't have to be sitting on the front row. We're so delighted you're here. Thank you.
Sorry, I got off work late.
No, just come on in. And I've told you for this and other stuff. And again, this is a marker. When we started the church in Campbelltown, there was a long period of time where we had 21 kids and 11 adults. And our son Luke at 7 was the oldest kid. So when you try to have a church with 21 kids, 7 and under, and they bring their friends, this is no bother at all. This is trivial than compared to having 21 kids every church service. But the other 3 kids are all just thinking, okay, here Mom's about to die. And so she goes through and she says, "Greg, you've always been my favorite, and because of this and this and this and this." And then she came to the second one and she says, "Ezra, you have always been my favorite." And then she gave all the different reasons why that Greg was her favorite. And so she did that for each of the 4 children. And that's kind of how I feel about studying the Gospels. My favorite tends to be the one that I'm reading right now, because there are certain qualities about each one. And what I want us to do, and we're going to do this very quickly because we'll just spend the rest of the time in John. Mental pictures. And like I said, in a word, we use royalty for Matthew, also the son of David, to teach about the king. Mark, the power, the 19 miracles, very important part of that. Luke teaches so much about love in parable and in life and things. And then John, and this is where we'll be tonight, believing you will have life. And notice that, and some will put as high as 90, depending upon your translations. But believe is used close to 90 times. And you think in a book of 21 chapters, that's a high frequency. And always remember, it's the verb and it's not the noun. If it was the noun, it would be faith. And so, for whatever reason, John chooses to talk about the process, the activity of believing, not as a person, place, or thing, which, faith is the substance of things hoped for. That's a noun. John doesn't use it as a noun one time. And that has to be very intentional. That all of these times, whenever he talks about this, it's an action, it's an activity, it's something that engages and people are involved with. And then the wonderful word life. I didn't write this down, and this is just kind of a mental note. The word for the good life in secular Greek was bios, B-I-O-S, and you will hear what scientific study in bios? Biology. And I'm sorry, this is a poor example, but commercials about the good life, they're young and they're drinking, that was a very common word that was used. Well, especially with John, but in the New Testament, when they talk about life, they use the word Zoe, Z-O-E, and you're going to hear zoology, Greek words for life. And so when the secular world talked about, this is the good life, is usually bios was the common word that was used. And John comes along and uses this word Zoe, and this word for life. If you notice, 43 times John uses the word life. And this is something we'll focus on tonight. And what an interesting way to talk about this and just anticipate. Jesus is going to be the creative action, the creative activity of physical life. And then when the Word becomes flesh, then he is also then going to become our spiritual life. And there's this constant parallel in John between the physical, like for example, bread of life. We'll see this, what food and bread is for us physically, then that's what Jesus is going to be for us spiritually. And all the way through John, there's this physical and spiritual. In him, all things were made that were made, and without him was not anything made that was made. And so, and in Colossians 1, you'll find this 15 through 17. All things are made through him, and in him all things consist or hold together. So between John 1 and Colossians 1, there's also one in Hebrews, but we'll just do these two. I think in my mind, he's walking by the Sea of Galilee, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed seed in a field. And while he's doing that, then he is holding together the universe because he's the creative power and the agency of everything that has to do with both physical life and, as we're going to see, spiritual life as well. So when I think of John, I think of those preaching, baptizing, discipleship things, very, very significant. And we looked at that earlier. The A's and the C's alternate with each other. And again, immediately straightway, and Mark just goes straight through. When I think of Matthew, I keep hearing those 5 times, when Jesus had finished either saying these things, teaching these parables or whatever. And as we said, and this is still just staggering, 90% of Mark is in Matthew, but then Matthew adds these fabulous teaching sections. When I think of Luke, I think of a geographical circle. Zechariah is not only in Jerusalem, but he's in the temple, and that's where all the activities start, the visions start, the angels come, and all those things happen related to the temple. And then we're going to go up into Galilee and do the Galilean ministry. 9:51, he sets his face toward Jerusalem. And then we come across and do the Perean ministry, and it's not straight down. Some of it's back and forth. And then we come and do a Judean ministry. He's crucified, and after he's ascended back into heaven, the disciples go back to the temple. And so I literally think of Luke as a geographical circle where he describes the activities and the things that happen from there. I didn't go back and hunt this down tonight. But Luke is the one who tells us that Jesus was 30 years old when the ministry began. And he also gives us more chronological, historical detail of people outside the Jewish nation, and whether it's rulers, leaders, other things, than anyone else. And so Dr. Luke is very much our practical historian. So when we come to John, well, let me just mention this. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, one of the hinge events in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is the confession, "Who do men say that I am?" And like I said, you're going to be in chapter 8 in Mark, so you're halfway through. You're only going to be in chapter 9 in Luke because we're going to have this Perean ministry from 9:51 through 8:10. And we're going to be in chapter 16. And the event where everything changes in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is the confession, "You are the Christ." Since John has only 7%, and that's just kind of makes my head hurt in terms of just trying to We're talking about the same story, the same event, and let's say it the other way. 93% of Matthew, Mark, and Luke is not in John. So he just gives us just a totally different perspective of things. And he doesn't have the confession. When we study, Lord willing, on Sunday about, of all things, the Transfiguration, there's no Transfiguration in John. And we'll talk about this a little bit. The Word became flesh, dwelt among us. We have beheld his glory, glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And you would anticipate if he's talking about glory, because Jesus physically is, can I use the term metamorphosis, transformed? I'm sorry, not growing up on Hebrew, when I think of metamorphosis, I think of a tadpole to a frog, which biblical writers, that wouldn't be their caterpillar to butterfly. And there is a physical, and I think it's Mark that says it was like whiter than anyone could bleach clothes and things, his appearance. There was a complete physical metamorphosis, transfiguration, and they beheld the glory of Jesus when they woke up physically. And John doesn't cover that. And we'll talk about the details of that in a second. And because he talks about signs, belief, and life, then the hinge in the Gospel of John is going to be because the triumphal entry, and they're going to come in and they're jerking down the palm branches, they're laying down their garments, and I'm sorry, this is not in the biblical account, but when I came into the world, my dad was breaking horses for grocery money. So BJ, if you have a horse that you can't ride, you leave it with my dad, and possibility of bruises and maybe some broken bones later, and you pay him $25 and you can ride your horse. And that's a hard way to make $25 for grocery money. He was about this tall. He was also a jockey. I hesitate to say I helped him a couple of times, but I was involved a couple of times, and we bought a Shetland pony. Sorry if you're city folks, I don't want to be gross, but the horse was not broke. And so I'm on him bareback, and Dad's got a rope around his neck, and I'm trying to hold on to the mane of the horse, and he stops, and I come straight over the top. And I'm trying to get green stuff out of my eyes and out of my ears and out of my nose. And Dad has got a hold of my arm and thrown me back on the horse and says, get on, before he realizes that you're off. Get on. And I'm trying to say, Dad, I'm trying to breathe. I don't care. Get on and hang on. Now, hang on this time. Don't let him throw you off, you know. And I'm not trying to be gross, but it's hard to hang on to this when you're doing this and trying to, thankfully I didn't have glasses on. And let's go find a colt that no one has ridden and ride him in front of a whole crowd of people pulling down palm branches. That to me is as big a miracle as there is in the Gospel of John. In Beckham County, Sayre is the county seat in the middle, and Elk City is so much bigger. And in fact, they have the big Route 66 museum. Several times they tried to get the county seat moved to Elk City, so we had all kinds of rivalry. But Elk City had a huge rodeo. I think it was in the fall, but I don't remember if it was fall or spring. But anyway, they wanted the Sayre band to come, and so the Elk City band went first. And there were between 20 to 25 horse riding clubs, and the Sayre band was last. Which told you something about our relationships. And our band director, because we did 7 through 12, we were a small school, 2A, but our band was 7 through 12. So every year we got this little speech. Normally, we try to stay in line while we're marching in a parade. And of course, we only play something that we've memorized because you don't want anybody looking at music. And he said, however, you need to be careful and avoid debris and liquids that are on the street, because you bring these horses off the farm and you have up to 20 horse clubs with multiple horses that have gone before you, and there's just stuff all over the street, both in clumps and wet and everything. And he said, we'll sometimes be a little bit like a snake, But he said our objective, we have a higher objective than staying in rank, and that is we don't want anybody to fall and break anything. So do the best you can and try to reform as you can, but just understand that's going to be the objective, is getting to the other end, and the bus will come pick you up, because we don't want you walking back after you've already walked down there, and we'll come pick you up on the other end. So from that background, when I read in John, oh, we're going to go find a colt that no one has ridden, and then get on him and ride in front of a whole crowd of people who are shouting and yelling and pulling down palm branches and all sorts of stuff. That's the hinge in John. And it's kind of like, by the time we've raised a 4-day-old dead man, and then he turns around and comes into the city proclaiming as the king and Hosanna and the son of David, then the Pharisees are deciding, okay, no more talk. We've only got one option, and the option is to kill him. And so that's where that's so significant. We'll look at these in just a second, but anticipate there are going to be 7 signs, and the signs will tell us what he did. And I put them in order tonight. And then on the other side are 7 I ams. And we hear the burning bush, I am who I am. And there's going to be 7 I ams, and they're going to be interspersed throughout the book. And then we'll notice this. It's only because of John that we have any context that there were 3 years. The first 3 will mention early life and stuff, but they'll only mention one Passover. And we'll notice tonight it's because of John that he mentions at least 5 feasts by name. He adds one more, which we're not quite sure which it is. But 3 out of those feasts are going to be the Passover. And so it's from John that we have any idea that we'll hear. Luke says Jesus was 30 years old when the ministry began, and then John will be the one that will tell us this is where the events took place in terms of multiple Passovers and things like that. Okay, Greg, can you pass that back to next row? You get that to guys on the front, give those to the back row. You guys do this one. If there's extra, just put them down on the end, and we'll have them there. I doubt anyone else will come. Brother McCord was doing a New Testament survey, and when he got to this particular part, he said, if I only had 2 verses to describe Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it would be John 20, 30, and 31. And he said, while it's about the signs and the specific things, and the word that comes to my mind is the word selective. Each of the writers have to be very, very selective about the events that they choose. And if you remember the first night, we did the cafeteria tray, and we go in, and then you select not a spoonful of everything, but you select this salad, this meat, these vegetables, this either bread or dessert, and then that makes up that meal. And that's what I think of, is that you're going to have like the life and the example, you're going to have the parables, you're going to have the miracles, you're going to have the discourses and things. And then each of the writers comes along from this huge list of things and then selects the parts of the life of Jesus that help both to tell the story, but I think to make a point to the people who are reading the book for the first time. And because we have the 4 unique guys and the 4 different audiences, then that contributes to that. So many other signs, and the word miracle is hardly used. I think it's just used a couple of times. Sometimes even the word wonder is used, but John chooses to say signs and these are written, many others are not written in this book, these are written that you may believe. And I don't like to talk about textual variants, but some of the early manuscripts either have that you may believe or you may continue to believe. When I use John with a non-Christian, I'm using it so that you can initially come to a point of faith and belief. It could also possibly be, like with Theophilus, he's been taught that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught in Luke 1. John also is, to me, very effective in helping people to solidify, to have, you don't have to just be a person just coming out of darkness in order to read these things. But the point of believing is that you may have life. And there's that just wonderful term, that Zoe. And as we're going to see, eternal is oftentimes used. And in English, when we think of eternal, we primarily think in terms of quantity, time. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's how we tend to think about it. However, PJ, if your life is the pits, and I promise you it will never end, what kind of blessing is a life that is merely in terms of quantity, but is a terrible life? The real focus of eternal life, and I go from this to this, is that eternal life in Jesus is a quality of life that never ends. And so in connection with this Zoe, the life aspect, then John will be talking about, yes, he's the, as we're going to see, he's the originator, he's the creator. And I like to say it like this: God said, and Jesus did. I like the word agency. Jesus is the agency of creation. And if we send Solomon out here and say, Solomon, we want you to cut down this tree, how are you going to do it?
What tools do you give me?
That's your choice.
Chainsaw problem?
Good. At least you weren't there to help build the ark by hand. But think about it. You can prop the chainsaw up next to the tree all day long, and the tree isn't going to get cut down. If it's big enough, you can go out there by yourself and push on it and bend on it, and the tree's not coming down. You will cut the tree down through the agency of using the saw. And you have to have both of them together for the tree to come down. Either one by itself, it doesn't happen. And so, like I said, John 1, Colossians 1, Hebrews 1, then everything that we can see around us is here. And here's this term logos. God spoke, God said, Jesus did. All things were made through him, and without him is not anything made that was made. And we find out that not only was Jesus the agency to create everything that has to do with life, but then he's also the sustainer of that life. And that's going to be very, very significant. So I did 2 ones. The second one's supposed to be a Roman numeral. The word logos is our word for word. And in the beginning was the Word. And the word logos, especially in Greek philosophy, because the Greeks are always talking about the universe is composed of, and I don't remember all, there are like 4 of them, wind and fire and rain or something, these physical elements. But in philosophy, they use the word logos to say, somewhere there has to be a reason, we would even use the term gravity, but somewhere there is something that holds the universe together. And you think even primitive man looks out and looks at the stars and the world around us, and a careful reflection, even if you've never read the Bible, is just to think, well, let me just say it this way. One of the very early lessons years and years ago that I did when Tim first came, he asked me to do a lesson having to do with evidences and things. And I entitled the lesson, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Because when you really think about it, you use a telescope or a microscope, and there's design, there's created activity, there's the fingerprints of God on everything. And to me, it takes more faith to believe that we came from an amoeba or crawled out of slime or whatever else it was that is this millions and millions of years than it is to believe that God said it and we're the product of intelligent design. And that was the topic of that. And Jesus is the agency of the creation to bring all these things together. So for the Greeks, logos, the word, has to do with that which holds the universe together. In the Hebrew world, God said. Logos is the spoken authoritative word of God. And so it's very interesting whether you originally were from a Greek culture or from a Hebrew culture, you would both hear the word logos in very different ways, but both of them equally apply to Jesus. And I think that's kind of the bringing together of what's happening in this early part of John. In the beginning was the word, logos. The logos was with God. He was God. All things are made through him. Without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And so whether you're reading this for the first time from a Greek point of view, you're thinking, aha, he must be the one who holds everything together. If you're reading from a Hebrew point of view, you're thinking, oh, God said, the spoken word of God and authoritative word of God. And I always find that very interesting in looking at that. So in his origin, he is not born, he is not created. He is God and was with God in the beginning. And I just put this in bold. The Word is the physical and spiritual life-giving force of the universe. And something that I think about until I just kind of my head hurts and I just have to stop at some point. It's just nearly beyond comprehension that the one who spoke the universe into existence is the same one who died on the cross. You know, the whole thing about calling down legions of angels and stuff like that. If you are the creating agency of the universe, there was a restraint for the Lamb of God to die on the cross that even as human beings we can hardly comprehend. Just the surrender and the emptying of himself to do that. And notice, and this is just before number 2 there, close to a third down, in him was life, the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and if you have a translation to help me with what you have in John 1:5, some translations will say the darkness has not overcome it. But do any of you have something like comprehended it or understood it?
Darkness did not comprehend.
Okay. Both of those are legitimate translations. Remember, see many times you pick up a carton of Coke, Dr. Pepper, whatever, and it's got 4 or 6 containers in it. You pick up a word and it has different meanings. Both of those are true in a significant way. One is the darkness never did comprehend who he was. They never did understand who he was. You know, the spies come and talk with him. They're always asking, you know, who are you and why are you doing this and who gave you this? So one summary of the ministry of Jesus is that the whole time, the darkness, which again, you already are into this metaphoric, symbolic description, the enemies and those against Jesus, the forces of Satan, are the forces of darkness. They never did really understand who he was. And the irony is that the apostles really didn't either, totally, until after Pentecost, after the Spirit comes. But look at the second one. The darkness didn't overpower it. And you'll hear Jesus talking about, you know, the time of darkness is at hand, literally as he's getting ready to go to the cross. And even in this very, very opening, John is going to start talking about this gulf that is going to develop. And I didn't write this down. I didn't quite know how to do it, but I always think about this in my hands. on this side, if this is just the concept of belief, trust, every time people begin to have a better comprehension and belief in Jesus, the opposition will always be growing at the same time. And as people come to trust and believe and have that understanding, then it's always being ratcheted up. And John's just going to call it the forces of darkness. And so this imagery of, as we're going to see, I am the light of the world, and anticipate what the SUN is for our solar system is what the SON is for our soul. So there's this constant physical, yes, he's the creator, a physical aspect, and then you look at that and then you get to think about it, yes. And help me for a second. Someone help me with the word photosynthesis. What's photosynthesis?
Waiting.
That's what happens when the plants produce food.
Yes. The whole process of light coming into a leaf, and then a leaf takes the ingredients from the roots, and you have this photosynthesis, this life-giving process, and all the things that photo is our word for light. So this photosynthesis that takes place physically, and even an indoor plant, if it just gets no light at all, it's going to die. And so Jesus is going to be the physical light, in that God said, and he spoke the universe and the sun into existence physically. And then as we're going to see, what the sun, SUN, is for us physically and for life is what the SON is going to be for us spiritually. And just anticipate that parallel is going to come about. Now, John the Baptist has one objective in the book of Gospel of John, and that's the word witness. And in a class I recently did on Wednesday night, do you remember Apollos is going to come from Alexandria, and he's going to come to Ephesus, and he was mighty and eloquent in the scriptures, but he only knew the baptism of John. Aquila and Priscilla take him aside, teaching the way of the Lord more accurately. Paul comes to Ephesus, and here are 12 men who only know the baptism of John. So we have Apollos and the 12 men in Ephesus, 20 years after the cross, who haven't heard that Jesus was crucified. And John lived the latter years around the area of Ephesus. And so there's a lot of details about John that aren't there. And there's a really singular focus. John is the witness. John is the one who came to prepare the way of the Lord. And then here's the contrast. This is number 3. The world didn't comprehend him or overcome him, whichever is in your translation. Both are good. But John also tells us the world didn't know him. And look at the third one. His own people did not receive him. He came into his own, and his own received him not. And let me just mention this and we'll get you right in. Until years and years after I left home, the front door of our house was never locked. Unless we were out of state. Any of you grew up, we never locked the front door. Oil boom came in, people started coming in from all over the country, and you needed to lock everything. It was just a major contrast. But probably until my 30s or so, anytime you could get home, didn't have to look for a key, you just walked in the front door. And I think it's like you coming home and you knock on the door of your own house, and the people inside know it's you, and they won't open the door. He came into his own, and his own received him not. So they didn't comprehend him, the darkness didn't overcome him, they didn't know him, but they also, you'll see that expression, his own people didn't receive him. PJ.
So John the Baptist dies about a year into Jesus' ministry, right?
Mm-hmm. At least.
There's 2 years that Jesus is essentially so John has stepped out of the way, as it were, and Jesus is the most prominent figure. And 20 years later, they're still preaching the
Repent, the kingdom's at hand.
Baptism of John.
Mm-hmm.
What is the rest of the message if Jesus isn't part of it?
Well, let's look at it this way. Because we have, let me just say in Australia, every time the Queen's dog sneezed, we heard about it in Australia. I mean, anything had to do with royalty or the Queen, there were, like the paparazzi, there were people, royal watchers, and so we have instantaneous information that none of us want to know all the details about so quickly. No radio, no TV, and no newspaper. And it has to be done by word of mouth. And what's significant is that the two major academic cultural centers of the ancient world were at the Greek, were Athens and Alexandria. And so here's an example of a man, he's not out in the desert somewhere. He's in one of the major metropolitan areas, and 20 years has gone by, and the word of mouth that Jesus has died hasn't caught up with him yet. Now, if they'd had newspapers, if they'd had radio, on, that would be very different. And see, that's one of those important things for us to go back and look at that within and the same thing with the 12 men in Ephesus. I'll tell you what I believe and open to interpretation. And Brother McCord mentioned this. He said, in the New Testament, no one who was baptized in the baptism of John before the cross were rebaptized. If they were, we don't have a record of it. And Brother McCord said, I believe that those 12 men were baptized into the baptism of John after the cross. Because somebody who had heard John, been a disciple, they had traveled and they were taught that. But whichever way it is, it's very clear that 20 years later, we still have people in the Roman Empire who haven't heard the crucifixion story. They've heard prepare the messenger of the way the Lord is coming. And that's all they know. And even someone like Apollos, who is eloquent and mighty in the scriptures, doesn't know what Paul Harvey would call the rest of the story. And they're okay up to where they are, but they haven't heard the full account of this is the details of what took place. And see, for us, that's just kind of hard for us to even to imagine because of the instant sharing of news around the world. But we have two cases there in the end of Acts 18 and into 19 of one man and 12 men who are 20 years after the ministry of John, and they only know about John's coming. And to me, that's just an interesting insight both into the communication to the world of the first century. But look right in the middle. This is one of my favorite verses in the early part of John. But, and here's the contrast, but to all who did receive him and who believed on his name, and again, see the verb, they received him, they believed in his name, he gave the right to become the children of God. And the word right is very significant. Like, for example, they will have the right to eat of the tree of life. You know, some of you heard me mention this not too long after we'd come back from Australia. I love to tube fish, put on the waders, get in the tube, and you know, most of the time the bait comes in from the bank. Well, if you get out, you can throw a plastic worm on a moss bed and let it set and then just pull it over the edge. And if there's a bass close by, he just can't stand to see this plastic worm dropping off of a moss bed because the bait's coming at him from a totally different direction. And if you don't have trees or something, if you hook a big one, you just let him pull you around till he gets tired. So you don't have to fight him and all this other stuff. So just love to do that. So I'm out of my dad's farm pond, bass fishing. Boy, this pickup comes screaming down the road, and this guy gets out and he says, "Do you know where you are?" And I said, "Yes." And I just kept fishing. He said, "What are you doing in here?" I said, "Well, I'm fishing." And he said, "This is Marshall Hartman's pond. You're not supposed to be in here." And I just let him go. You know, it's like you catch a big one. He just went on and on. And finally, I just said, did you notice the gate was unlocked? We always locked our gates. "Yeah. How did you do that?" And I reached in my vest pocket and I pulled out my dad's key and I said, "I've lived in Australia for 12 years and I've never met you. My name is Dale Hartman. I'm Marshall Hartman's oldest son. Stay as long as you want to." catch all the fish that you can. And I said, now you come back tomorrow, and whoever's in here, you run them off if they're not supposed to be here. Because Dad would go to Colorado and had a buddy to guard the ponds to keep people out. But I had the right to be there because my dad had given me the key. To all who believed in them, he gave them the right, the privilege, to be called sons and daughters of God. And regardless of our physical background, regardless of our family, that's one of the great privileges that we have as Christians. We have the right to be called the children of God. And that word is used a lot of different ways, but the one that always stands in my mind is, oh yes, they will have the right to partake of the tree of life. And I know it's trivial in comparison, but having the physical right to fish in my dad's pond, then when we get to heaven, we will have the right to partake of our Father's tree of life because we have been given the privilege of being the sons and the daughters of God. What a wonderful expression. We're born not of blood, nor the will of flesh or the will of man, but of God. Is anybody blood type O negative? Do you get calls from OBI to...
All the time.
Yeah. I'm O positive, so I'm good for A positive, B positive, O positive. My dad was O negative, and both when that cell phone came out, it'd be on the tractor and they'd say, Marshall, you fill in the blank. There's been an accident, she's had a baby, can you come in? And because you guys are universal donors in that sense. A bit trivial, speculation. I always wonder what blood type was Jesus. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And spiritually, we are all cleansed and saved by the blood of Jesus. And this is a part of that description that we're born, not of blood, not of the will of man, but we're born of the will of God. So the testimony, and these are whole lessons here, but when the Word became flesh, we beheld His glory. And let me just say this in a couple of sentences. Glory in the Gospel of John is not the Transfiguration. Glory is not going to be something that's magnificent, but it's when the Son of God empties Himself and serves and meets the needs of other people. And you look at this all the way through the Gospel of John, including the foot washing. The ministry of Jesus is reaching out to meet the needs of human people. And quick survey. Moses is on the mountain. I will hide you in the cleft of the rock. My goodness will pass before you because no one can see me and to live. And so God metaphorically places His hand over Moses. So what Moses couldn't see on Mount Sinai, they build the tabernacle and the glory of God comes in and Aaron and the priest are driven out. So what Aaron couldn't see in the tabernacle, Solomon builds the temple and the glory of God comes into the temple. So what Moses couldn't see on the mountain, what Aaron couldn't see in the tabernacle, and what Solomon couldn't see in the temple, John says, we saw when the Word became flesh. And there's no transfiguration. There's no physical outward thing. It's a man living in backwater, rural Galilee who is serving and helping people. And you stop and think, all of us have physical limitations of whether we're talking about running or jumping or anything physically like that. But it's within the capacity of all of us, within ourselves, for the Word to become flesh in our lives and for us to reach out and to serve and be of help to people. And that's what glory is going to be in the Gospel of John. From the fullness of His grace, we've all received one blessing after another. The verse 16 will say, grace upon grace. I was at a men's retreat at Quartz Mountain after we'd come back from Australia, and we'd had a break, so I walked from the cabins just to the west and got up on the edge of the railroad tracks in the east side of Lake Lugert. And we'd been there years earlier, and I'd done a church camp, and we'd talked about the miracles of Jesus. And we had a great kid with a lot of personality. It was just, and we're talking about the miracles and Jesus walking on water and calming the winds and the waves. So we're on the shores on the north side of Lake Lugard, and you can imagine the wind's blowing 20, 30 mile an hour in western Oklahoma. So I said, now, John, I want you to go down and I want you to stop the wind. And he looked at me and I said, yeah, just in front of the camp, we were there just sitting there. I said, you go down and you stop the wind. And he's a great sport. He took a deep breath. He went, stop! And of course, nothing happened. And I said, John, now we want to watch you walk on water. So he takes his shoes and socks off and rolls his pants up to his knee. And I say, oh, you have little faith. Just get in, just get out here and walk on water. And so he was barefoot and thankfully didn't get his pants totally wet as he didn't do it. And I said, look at this. Humanly, none of us can do this. Only the Son of God can say, peace be still, and the wind will stop. Only the Son of God can walk on water. So I'm back, 30 years later, and this time, rather than causing the wind to stop, I'm going, blow! And it's just going, shh! And I'm going, yes! But just thinking, I can't have any control over this. But while I'm walking around on the spillway and just thinking all this, I'm thinking, where is grace used in the Gospels? From the fullness we've all received grace upon grace. The law came through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus. As soon as I got back to Oklahoma City, I had to get down my concordance. If this is the cross, the word grace is used less than 5 times before the cross. And I thought, okay, this is how I can remember it. Grace is a cross word, and it's used dozens and dozens of times after the cross, but grace is hardly used at all before the cross. And John is going to say, we've all received grace upon grace, one blessing after another. The law came through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus, and all the blessings of grace are the result of the cross. Quick definition, grace is God giving us what we do not deserve, and I do an open hand this way. Mercy is God not giving us what we do deserve. And then here's this very interesting statement. No one has ever seen God. This is verse 18, John 1. The only God who is at the Father's side has made him known. Some translations will say revealed him. The word exegesis is the idea of drawing something out. And Jesus is saying, as I say it the other way, John is saying Jesus is the exegesis of God. It's always amazing to go to a place where we've thought about but we've never seen with our eyes. And in 2019, we got to go to Jerusalem and Masada and the Sea of Galilee. And all these things you'd read about all of your life, and just kind of pinching yourself to think, I've read about this from as soon as I could even listen and hear things. But isn't it different to be able to see something? And John says, no one has ever come from the Father except Jesus. And one of the big themes in the Gospel of John is that Jesus has come to reveal, to explain, to draw the meaning of God out, because he has come from the bosom of the Father. And it's a very unique thing that's a part of that. Let's do a couple of things, and we'll take a quick stretch break and finish up. There are 7 days in chapter 1. If you sit under the dotted line, I've mentioned this another time, we'll do this really quickly. But look, 128 is one day, John is there. 2, 3, and 4, the next day, the next day, the next day. So 129, 135, 143. So we have 4 days, okay? Everybody follow? And then when you come to chapter 2, just when you come to the turning the water to wine, then John says, on the 3rd day. So we start with, in the beginning was the Word was with God. We have 7 days of creation in Genesis 1. Here's an echo of 7 actual days in the life of Jesus. And what's amazing is that we hardly have more than a month of the whole life. And between the introduction and the first sign, then John is going to give us 7 actual days that are there. Let's look at the back page, and let me just show you 2 things quickly to anticipate. And if anyone has to go, we always understand that. But look down under Roman numeral 2, and let me show you what I tried to do. See the word signs on the left-hand side in bold? I tried to list the 7 signs, and the reason I did this is that I put the I ams indented a little bit, and notice how many signs do we have before the first I am. Everybody see what I'm talking about? We're going to have 5 signs on the left-hand side. So we're going to turn the water to wine, heal the nobleman's son, the cripple, the 5,000 walking on water. And see, we're down to 6:16. Everybody with me now in terms of that? And then the next column, and I put I ams up at the top, our first I am is not till 6:35. So this is what we'll explore when we come back. When I look at the signs, then I think, and this is bold right in the middle, the signs tell us this is what Jesus did. And John says there's many of them, but I've written these at you. So this is what he did. And then he's going to give you, and particularly a person, and like I said, all those years in Australia, only one person had ever read the Bible that I talked with. It still just stretches my mind to think about talking to people who've never read the Bible before in their life. And so John gives you 5 chances to see this is what he did. And then he begins telling you this is who he is with the I ams. Do you see the contrast? So we're going to get 5 chances. These are written that you may believe. And rather than just right off saying I am, then the structure of John internally is that he's going to give us 5 signs initially, very specific, very calculated, very focused. And then once we've done 5 signs, 2 more to come, then we start on this side and we start introducing the I ams to tell us the nature of the person. So anticipate the signs. This is what he did. And then as you come to understand that, and as the person comes to believe, then in addition to that, and look at those, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. And so he's going to have 7. And that's why mentally when I think of this, I think of 2 columns, 2 different opportunities for a person to kind of think and stretch and to have their senses open to that. But John gives us a chance to see what he did first, and then starts filling out, he came to explain the Father. And Jesus is going to say, if you've seen the Father, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And that'll be part of his explanation as we go through, and we'll work through that after we get through with our break. On the back of the second page, and it's at 1:4, 2 things here, and then we'll start looking at the signs and the things that John writes more about love than the other Gospels combined. And look at that. Matthew 11, Mark 4, Luke 12. And there are 2 very specific words in John. Our word agape is used 36 times as a noun. Sorry, I'm wrong. 36 times as a verb, and then 7 times as a noun. The other word is phileo, and you'll hear Philadelphia, brotherly love. Phileo is used 13 times as a verb and 6 times as a noun. And again, here's a whole lesson. If you just want to locate these, Young's Concordance is the best to do this, because Young's will come along and say, here's love, and then all the words that are agape will be under one heading, and then when the word changes, all the words for phileo then will be listed. Strong's tends to alternate them, and they're harder to see, but if you go to Young's, if you ever want to look for a word, see like our word pure, one of the words for pure has to do with like pure gold, a singleness of element, not contaminated. The other word for pure is katharizo, from which we get the word catharsis. And you think there's a whole lot of things, if we have an accident or something, probably my closest friend in football, we were playing our senior year, and this is horrible. We're playing defense, and he tackles a guy, but then there's someone laying on him, and they fall on his arm, and they didn't catch it, but it broke his arm, but the bones went into the ground and then came back inside. And they set the bones without doing the catharsis, the cleansing. And so he starts getting this temperature and this fever and everything, and then they bring him to Oklahoma City. So now we have to go back in, have a whole surgery, clean things out. It was just horrible. So catharsis has to do with something that, can I say, could be either dirty, contaminated. Let's see, like for example, we've all either had a really good laugh or a really good cry and kind of gone, and so it's both kind of emotional and physical. Well, that's also one of the words for pure. But see, it's a whole different meaning to say something is pure gold, and then something has gone through a catharsis and has now been cleansed. So if you look at Young's Concordance, all the words under each one will kind of be in one section. I grew up hearing lessons that the word agape was kind of the higher love, and the word phileo was the lower love. When you look at the list of phileo there, one of them's going to be the Father loves the Son. I don't think that's a lesser love. Jesus talks about he has loved the apostles. So I think they're different words, but I think it's an overstatement to say, well, agape is the higher word and phileo is lesser or lower. They're different, but they're not necessarily higher or lower from that. 1:5 is something that you don't see in print very often, but I think is very, very significant. 3 times, and it's not in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, 3 times there is something said about being cast out of a synagogue. And you can see the text there. The blind man's parents are afraid to acknowledge who he is for fear they will be cast out of the synagogue. John 12. Many of the authorities believed. And see, here's your belief and unbelief and your struggle that's going on. But they don't confess him because they might be put out, cast out of the synagogue. And then when we come to chapter 16, they will put you out of the synagogues. To me, and again back to our cafeteria tray, that wouldn't be there unless the readers are having some possibility or some consideration of that happening to them. Not found in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. But again, to me, those things are very intentional. And did any of us grow up on a party line? Did you have like 2 shorts, 2 longs, a long and a short? Solomon, there's 4 to 6 families on one circuit. So when the telephone rings, if it's you guys may be 2 shorts, it go da-da. Everybody on the thing knows, oh, that's their so yours might be a long and a short. My grandmother was insomniac and didn't watch a lot of TV, and so when the phone rang, she was an artist at putting her hand on the receiver and then just listening into the conversation. Okay? Isn't this right?
We had a neighbor like that.
Yeah. My high school girlfriend was on the same party line with my grandmother. So we assumed 95% of the time we had company while we were talking on the line. Well, and the girls across the road, their mother left them, and Dad was trying to do the best he could, and my grandmother had several adjectives for them. And Johnny K, one of the girls, is talking to her friend and Sarah about that. Starts with a B across the road, and she's nosy and she listens in all the time, and she doesn't mind her own business. And my grandma comes in and says, Johnny K, if you don't straighten up your mouth, I'm going to come over there and wash your mouth out with stuff. Absolutely confirmed everything that she had told her friend. So when I read the statement, reading a New Testament letter is like listening to half of a telephone conversation. I think, yes, but you weren't on a party line. But when you have something like this, 3 significant times cast out of the synagogue, something happened on the other end for that to be there. That's not there by accident. And those are the kinds of things to start looking for when you're in. So this is what we'll do again. We'll come back to the cross to say, okay, Mark probably written to people who are Romans. Jewish customs are explained, but we're going to put on blinkers and be Romans and say, and not having at this time the other 3, we're the first ones to get this, so we're going to read it, and the things that are there are to address specific things that are going on. Something is going on in John where the readers are likely to be cast out of synagogues, or they have relations that are as well. So Roman numeral 2, along with 7 days, we have the 7 signs, and then 7 I ams, and we've already mentioned this. I like this term, the signs are significant because they point beyond themselves to the power of Jesus. And we mentioned this last week. If you're coming from the Red River and you see a sign that says Oklahoma City, 70 miles, you don't stop and get out and hug the sign and say, we're here, we're here. The sign points you to the destination. And that's how I see John using the miracles. Yes, it's the power of Jesus, but they point us beyond the event to the significance of the power and the deity of Jesus in that sense. And so the signs are credentials, and there it is. Signs tell us what he did. And then as we're introduced to those, then John will start saying, okay, here are the I ams. This is who he is. So let's do the signs first, so we're going to go straight down. But I wanted to put them in such a way so you can see how they interlace, kind of like how they tie together. But let's go straight down. Water changed to wine. And I forgot to put this down. Merrill Tenney, T-E-N-N, it's either Y or E-Y, was a New Testament student in an earlier generation. And he was the first one, and so these are his designations. And again, when I'm talking to someone who's a non-Christian, we're going to read the water turned to wine. And then we're going to talk about Jesus had the power over quality. And depending upon a person's background, and you think some non-Christians, they know a lot about wine, literally. How is it made, and on it goes. And Australians can drink a sailor under the table. They have a lot of exposure to alcohol. And so we have something physically to talk about. What's the process? How does it happen? And what would take place if you had water and then instantly had the power to change the quality of the physical water to something that normally takes a long process and all the brewing and all this other stuff. There's the power of Jesus. He had the power to change the quality of the water to wine. And then here it comes. Jesus is going to have the spiritual capacity to change the quality of your life. So they're all going to go from physical to spiritual. The second one, the nobleman's son is healed, and just give the word and he's healed at a distance. And a brand new Christian, very good question. I didn't laugh at her. She said, is the phone line to heaven ever busy? Okay. You didn't grow up in VBS, you didn't grow up in church. That's a good question. What if all these people are praying at the same time? Is the line to heaven ever busy? And Jesus has the power over distance and over space. And he's still who he is in heaven, the same that he was on earth. And his capacity to help us and be with us is not diminished by the fact he's at the right hand of the Father. A cripple a man who's been crippled for 38 years is healed. And again, depending upon the background, Greg, of the person and on it, I imagine we've got calluses and sores wherever we're sitting, either on our legs or our bottoms or anything else. And the word atrophy, the word atrophy, where you you know, I listened to a guy, and we're back with Mark Spitz, was it 7 Olympic medals? And this physio type person, physiotherapist, they said, if you put Mark Spitz in a bed and didn't let him walk for a month after he won his gold medals, and then rolled him over to the Olympic pool, he would drown before he could swim to the other end in a month. The atrophy of the muscles in a month for an Olympic swimmer. And then you stop and think, he's never used these muscles for 38 years. And I'm sure people have carried him, all this other stuff, all, calluses and everything else. And then Jesus says, stand up and walk. And so there's the power over time. And again, regardless of what your life was like, regardless of what you did before you knew Jesus, then Jesus is going to have the same power to help you with the spiritual things in your life if you come to him, believe in him. And then the feeding of the 5,000, the power over quantity. And he's a little boy. And I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be sarcastic, but don't think of loaves of Wonder Bread. Think more like little biscuits, he's a little guy. And this isn't the word for the fish with the head and the scales. It's probably broiled piece. So this is a little bit. And then Matthew's going to tell us, and women and children. So typically we say 5,000 men, and then Matthew tells us, oh, and by the way, the girls and the kids were there too. And there were 12 baskets left over. And so spiritually, whatever is needed in your life, again, whether it's grace, forgiveness, or goodness, quantity is no challenge for Jesus. Walking on water, the power over natural law. And you think if he created it, then he could cause the winds to stop, could walk on the water. The healing of the blind man, and I did not write these down, and my memory may be wrong, but it's something like, there's 3 times in Isaiah, and I'm going to say 35, 42, and 49, but you can just check the word for blind. All of the miracles that Jesus did, in one form or another, were done by a prophet in the Old Testament, with the exception of the giving of sight to the blind. And so just check the word blind in concordance, and you'll find them in Isaiah. When the Messiah comes, the blind will see, the deaf will hear, the dead will be raised, and on and on. And can I use the signature? The signature miracle that's going to be reserved for the Messiah, promised 700 years earlier, is going to be the giving of the sight to the blind. John the Baptist, and see, it's actually closer to a year because John's in prison for 18 months. And so we're getting closer to the end. But are you the one to come, or shall we look for another? And Jesus just keeps right on doing what he's doing with all the miracles. And then he says, you go tell John, and listen carefully, the blind see, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, good news is preached to the poor. Can I use the word code? Knowing that John would know the book of Isaiah, Jesus doesn't say, yes, I'm the Messiah. You go tell John the things that you've read about the coming of the Messiah is taking place. And you read through the Old Testament, there's one time that the prophets lead some blind people away, but in terms of just restoring sight, all of the miracles that Jesus does are done by a prophet in the Old Testament, with the exception of the giving of sight to the blind. And I always think the signature miracle, that's the one, that's the Messiah. Merrill Tenney uses the word misfortune. And what I do like about this, remember the apostle said, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus says, so neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this was done for the glory of God. And how do I say this? This is even hard to say. All kinds of things can happen to us that are tragic in a human sense, that none of us would want to happen. But in time, God may choose to use that misfortune in a way for our benefit. And I'm thinking like Helen Keller. You would much prefer to have your eyes. But then you think, with the misfortune, what did she go ahead and do with that? And you probably know people like that who've turned some type of misfortune, and while we wouldn't want them to have that, they've worked with that in one way or another.
So the idea seems to be, at least kind of in my mind, there are things that are tragedies, but they're not evil.
Yeah, yeah. And we've all seen people, something happen, and there's an intersection, and they either turn to God or away from God when those things take place. One of my son's dear friends, and Luke was with Kent in Australia for the summer, got killed by a drunk driver by Crossroads Mall. Kid was never in trouble, always doing the right thing, just great kid. And Mom and Dad, how do you ever recover from a misfortune like that no one would ever choose for those things to happen? And that's a part of at least the discussion of what takes place with the healing of the blind man. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's these three questions, paying taxes, who's she married to, on and on. After this, they dare not asking questions are going to kill him. The turning point in the Gospel of John is that when you raise a 4-day-old dead man out of the grave and he's walking around, we can't talk anymore. And the last point we're going to look at tonight is the skeptics. They not only are making plans to kill Jesus, they're making plans to kill Lazarus. And my point to a non-believer is that why are you trying to kill Lazarus if they haven't raised him from the dead? And again, depending upon the person, and again, those of you in more medical fields, how many minutes do I have if I have a stroke or something and don't get oxygen to my brain? There's a very short period of time, and you can do circulatory system, you can do respiratory system, you can do, brain waves, on and on. 4-day-old dead man, restored to life and walks out of a tomb. And so the impetus in John is going to be the triumphal entry. That's kind of that last straw. But Jesus has already raised Lazarus, and it's the raising of Lazarus that is going to be the part that's going to bring about the crucifixion, the power over death. Okay? But can you see how in walking with either a new Christian or a non-Christian, you can go through and look at each one of those and then just talk about that. And like with death, what Jesus physically did for a man in a tomb, he's going to do with us and raise. And so with each one of them, there's a physical and a spiritual component. Now, back to the bread of life. These will go real quick. What physical bread is to our body, Jesus is to our soul, right? I am the bread of life. And the sermon in John is going to be after the feeding of the 5,000. So we've had this whole multitude with physical bread left over. Light of the world, SUN, photosynthesis for our world around us. SON is what Jesus is for our soul. The gate for the sheep. If you don't have a gate, the pen becomes a death trap if dogs, coyotes, animals get in. The gate is that final insurance of safety to protect from the outside. It keeps them in and keeps the other things out. And so physically the gate protects the sheep. Jesus provides protection for our souls. Good shepherd, and we'll look at this in a second, he lays down his life for the sheep. Resurrection and the life. Before he raises Lazarus, then in 11:25, Jesus announces, I am the resurrection and the life. And what Jesus physically did for Lazarus then is going to take place in our spiritual resurrection. The way, the truth, and the life. The word way is the same word for road or path. In the same way that we get where we're going tonight by a road, Jesus is the only path. And then there's the term for the vine, and the vine and the branches. So this last part will go really quick. You guys want to help us hand these out? I'll get it exactly right. There's several things I'll leave you to read on this one, but I just put text down for part of it, and when we hit these, I'll just give you the verse, and then we'll wrap this part up. I wanted you to be able to see the term feast, because, other parables will talk about everything from a wedding feast to other things. But notice, in the Old Testament, and this is, again, one of those memory things, there are 3 places, let me rephrase that. There are 2 places that the 3 major feasts are mentioned. And they're in Exodus 23 and Leviticus 23. So the second and the third book of the Old Testament have the record of, and there's more, but there's 2 times that the 3 feasts are mentioned. And Passover is first, 50 days later is Pentecost, and then Tabernacles or Booths. And these are 3 of the major feasts in the Old Testament. So when you look in John 2:13, and I only noticed this, going through this time, look at the term "at hand." John's very specific. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to the Passover. And then in 2:23, many believed in his name when they saw the signs he was doing. And there's this constant blending and merging together of signs, belief, and life. Then when you come to 5:1, we're not given which one this is. And so there's different opinions. But another feast is mentioned. So in 5:1, there was a feast of the Jews. Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And then the second Passover then is going to be in 6:4. The Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. And then in 7:2, and this is where his brothers don't believe in him. So the feast of either booths or tabernacles is kind of like the Jewish Thanksgiving. It's at the end of the year. And let me do this really quickly. The barley ripens first, and they would complete the barley harvest and then come to Jerusalem for Passover. While they're doing Passover and going back to wheat, it ripens later. They would go back home and do the wheat harvest. And we're familiar